For 6 years, Sergeant James Harrington had been one of the few black royal guards to uphold the prestigious traditions of Buckingham Palace with unwavering dedication. First noticing the woman's racist taunts, it seemed like just another tourist trying to provoke a reaction, the kind of thing which happens all too often during the changing of the guard ceremony. But when she crossed the line and slapped him across the face, something inside Harrington snapped. The choice he would make in that moment would shake the very foundations of what it means to be a royal guard, and the consequences would ripple through the halls of Buckingham Palace forever. Comment below where you're watching from today, and if you like this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe. Sweltering summer heat bore down on Buckingham Palace as the changing of the guard ceremony got underway. Sergeant James Jim Harrington, a black royal guard in his early 30s, stood at attention at his post in the East Gate, feeling the weight of the day pressing down upon him. Sweat trickled down with his face, soaking into the thick, red fabric of his uniform and the heavy, bearskin cap perched atop his head for the sake of discomfort. Jim did not move a single inch to give in to the urge to wipe his brow or shift in stance. He focused on his breathing as an anchor, holding composure and dignity against the punishing heat. The iconic ceremony unfolded around him, a spectacle of precision and tradition that never fails to draw crowds of eager onlookers. The regiment of guards marched in, their footsteps perfection. The regimental band was playing in perfect unison, its music echoing off the palace walls with a stirring melody that seemed to enhance the pomp and pageantry of the occasion. To Jim, it was a very regimented routine that he had done 1,000 times, yet he could appreciate the magic it held for the watchers. For many, this was a living, breathing symbol of British tradition and a continuing heritage of monarchy. Tourists jostled against the gates and fence of the palace, holding high their phones and cameras to get a record of every second of the ceremony. The crowd was diverse tapestry of humanity, families with excited children, couples stealing romantic glances between the marching guards, and groups of friends from various walks of life, some local, others having traveled from far-flung corners of the globe to see this quintessentially British spectacle. Children pointed excitedly, their eyes wide with wonder at the sight of the guards in their resplendent uniforms. Adults murmured in awe at the guards' discipline and poise, marveling that they could stay so still in the face of the oppressively hot and public attention on parade. Jim had, however, long ago acquired the skill to shut out the din and noise of the crowded. He focused his attention inwards, allowing the variety of remarks and snickers from those assembled public to fade into white noise. He knew his purpose: to maintain decorum and order, serving as both the icon and sentry of this treasured national heritage. Heat continued to rise as the changing of the guard ceremony started. Yet Jim did not once flinch as he stood there in the far east wing, standing ramrod straight and unwavering. Jim could not help but think of the hours and hours of training, the hard work, both physical and mental, that he had done to reach a position among the privileged royal guards. He remembered the pride he felt the first time he put on the classic uniform and how it made him feel responsibility. It wasn't just a job for Jim. It was his calling, a chance to be part of something greater than himself. The brief introspective moment was cut short by a shrill voice that cut through the silence. "Hey, Black. Just one, can you give us a smile for the camera?" Words heavy with condescension were unmistakably aimed at Jim. In the crowd, a blonde woman held her phone high, her face a blend of amusement and disdain. Jim's training kicked in immediately, his face remaining impassive as he stared straight ahead. Years of discipline allowed him to maintain his rigid posture and neutral expression, even as the woman's words sent a jolt of anger through him. He focused on his breathing, using it as an anchor to keep his emotions in check. Embittered by Jim's silence, the woman's tone became venomous. "What's with all this diversity?" she sneered, her voice carrying clearly over the murmur of the crowd. "If they're going to keep doing this nonsense, at least let real Britain wear the uniform." To make matters worse, the small gathering of the tourists around the woman laughed at her comments, their amusement only serving to intensify Jim's growing frustration. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, searching for any crack in his stoic facade, any sign. The woman's words had struck home. The woman, emboldened by Jim's silence, continued her rant. "Look at him, standing there like a statue. Can't even defend himself. Can you?" She taunted, her voice growing louder, I bet he doesn't even understand what I'm saying. Do you speak English, or just whatever they speak where you're from? The words cut deeper than any of the usual taunts the people had thrown at Jim during his time as a royal guard. They struck at the heart of his very identity, challenging not only his role as a soldier, but his right to be black and British. The seething anger inside him, now ready to spill over and cut through his careful, composed lines. "Oh, come on," the woman exclaimed, her voice heavy with mock disappointment. Not even a twitch. "Maybe if we poked him with a stick, head move. Anyone got a stick?" She laughed at her joke, looking around at the crowd for sympathy. A man standing nearby chimed in. "Leave him alone. He's just doing his job." The woman rounded on him, her eyes flashing. His job is to stand there. He is standing there looking pretty for all the tourists to see, and can't even manage that. Look at him. He doesn't even fit in with the rest of them. The jeers and taunts continued, being interrupted by some in the crowd laughing. The heat of the day, already feeling oppressive, now seemed to press in around Jim, making it hard to breathe. A drop of sweat ran down his back, and his palms were slick on the rifle bayonet inside his white gloves. But still he was frozen in place, a living statue in the face of adversity. The woman's loud words were added to by mocking tone, quickly drew more attention as onlookers began to hush her for disturbing the solemnity of the ceremony. A nearby security guard, noticing the escalating commotion, stepped forward to defuse the situation. He approached the blonde woman, his stance calm, yet authoritative, handling the matter with professional firmness. "Ma'am," the security guard said, his voice calm but authoritative, "I'm going to have to ask you to step back and respect the guard's space. They're not here for your entertainment." The woman turned to face the security guard, her expression a mix of indignation and amusement. "Oh, come on," she sneered. "It's all just a bit of fun. No harm done, right?" The security guard was unmoved. "Ma'am, I understand you may feel that way, but you caused a disturbance during the ceremony. These guards have a job to do. They're a vital part of our national heritage, and we ask that all visitors show them the respect they deserve." For a moment, it seemed as though the security guard's intervention might have the desired effect. The woman took a step back, followed by a young boy by her side. The crowd around her began to disperse somewhat, some with embarrassed looks on their face to have been identified with her. Jim, still standing at attention, felt a small measure of relief. While he couldn't show it outwardly, he was thankful for the intervention that was presented by the security guard, for it reminded him that there were still people out there that didn't share the same views of the prejudiced woman and showed respect and understanding for the dignity of his position. However, relief soon lived, for as soon as the security guard walked away, the woman returned to her position at the head of the line behind the fence and taunts him now, shouting louder. "Hey, you black one," she shouted, laughter dripping in ridicule. "You blend in well with that furry hat. Can't see a thing but your peepers. Haha. Show us your teeth so we can know you are really a human being." Her laugh shot through the air, sharp and cutting, and to Jim's discomfort, some of the tourists standing around her had laughed once more. They laughed uneasily, torn between their embarrassment and the apparent glee of the woman. The young boy, who had been trailing the woman's side, around 10 years old, was watching Jim with wide-eyed curiosity. He leans in closer to the fence, tugging on the woman's sleeve. "Why doesn't he smile?" Or Haley, the boy asked, his voice full of innocent wonder. "He's just standing there not doing anything," Haley huffed in exasperation. "Because he's a royal guard, you idiot," she snapped at the boy. "They're not supposed to move no matter how funny or hard you bother them." "But why does he wear that funny uniform if he's a guard? And why is his hat so big and fluffy? It looks really hot," Haley scoffed, rolling her eyes at her nephew. "Don't be stupid, Daniel. It's just for show. You knew it to make tourists like you gawk and take pictures." Daniel tilted his head, still watching Jim intently. "But Aunt Haley, why does he look so serious?" "He's not smiling at all," Haley sighed, clearly annoyed by the questions. "Because he can't think for himself," she sneered. "He's been told to stand there and look stupid. So that's what he does. Use your brain, Daniel." The boy frowned, clearly struggling to reconcile his aunt's words with what he was seeing. "But what if he needs to go to the bathroom? Or if he gets thirsty?" Haley let out an exasperated groan. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Daniel. That's enough," the blonde woman snapped. "If you're so fascinated, why don't we see if you can make him move? I bet he's not as disciplined as he pretends to be. The white ones are better at holding their posture, I've heard somewhere." Emboldened by his aunt's behavior and the lack of response from Jim, young Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of peanuts from with a wicked grin. He picked one and threw it towards Jim, watching in awe as it ricocheted off the shiny jackboot of the guard. Jim's expression did not change, his eyes staring straight ahead, but inside, he was in a mess. The incident of the peanuts, seemingly insignificant, was the harbinger of years of racism he had endured. now distilled down to this careless act of a child that did not know any better. It fanned the fires raging inside him and brought up every doubt and frustration he had bottled up. The din grew as Haley's voice rose, and the boy threw more peanuts through the fence. A black woman, apparently a local, came forward instructing the beau to quit loitering near the palace and advising Haley to keep him in order. This prompted an argument in the crowd, further fueling the bedlam of the scene. From within the fence, Major Timothy Hall, Jim's superior, who had happened by, moved toward. "Is there a problem here, Sergeant Major Hall?" asked his tone. Stern and authoritative Jim's voice was as steady as his posture as he replied, "No, sir, no problem, sir." But even as he spoke the words, he felt the weight of the lie. There was a problem, a deep, systemic problem that went far beyond this one incident. The security guard outside, noticing the escalating disruption, made his way back toward Haley, addressing her with a firm tone. "Ma'am, I've already warned you once. The guards are not here for your entertainment. If this behavior continues, he'll have to ask you to leave." His gaze then shifted to Daniel. "And you young man, keep your hands off the fence. If I catch you tossing anything else on palace grounds, it'll make sure you and your aunt," Daniel cut in quickly, "your aunt will be fined. And believe me, you won't enjoy that." Haley pouted and rolled her eyes, but eventually caved. Major Hall, content that the incident was now contained, turned his back leisurely and walked away. Yet this moment of resolution merely ramped up Jim's turmoil. And after that display, he felt even more unsettled, his outer shell cow, but now stewing. Jim's thoughts turned internal as his mind began to struggle with the heavier significance of his role. Did the uniform he wore truly represent an outmoded tradition, as the woman's jibe had pretended, or could it represent something much more, a Britain which encompassed and loved all its people, whoever they may be? The stifling atmosphere of the day showed no semblance of letting up as the ritual continued. In one of the lulls in the proceedings, young Daniel turned to his aunt, his face red and his face one of tedium and discomfort. "Aunt Haley, EWH on board, and it's so hot in here. Let's go's." Haley, her patience wearing thin, seized upon this opportunity to continue her provocation. "Oh, Daniel boy, you're right. This blackguard is a boring sight," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "But you know what? He's only boring you because he's the fake god. Look at over there. Those royal guards were the real ones," she added, gesturing to the formation further down the line. Jim's jaw clenched imperceptibly at these words, his resolve hardening, even as he fought to remain silent and unresponsive. So as the procession approached the center of Buckingham Palace, the crowd shifted, moving in the opposite direction to secure a better view. Amid the bustling movement, the woman Haley, a name Jim had now memorized from her interaction with the boy, grasped Daniel's hand, pulling him along with a rough tug. In the sudden commotion, Daniel's treasured toy guard figure that resembled Jim's uniform slipped from his grasp, landing inside the restricted area close to Jim's post. "My toy, my royal guard," Daniel cried out, his voice filled with distress. He tugged urgently at his aunt's sleeve. "Aunt Haley, my guard fell over there. Can you get it for me, please?" Haley, clearly annoyed by the boy's whining, rolled her eyes. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Daniel. It's just a stupid toy. Forget about it. The real procession's there, and you don't want to miss it." But Daniel was inconsolable. "Please, Aunt Haley, it's my favorite. Dad gave it to me before." His voice trailed off, choked with emotion. Haley let out an exasperated sigh. "Fine, if I'll shut you up." She turned her attention to Jim, who was still standing motionless at his post. "Hey, you blackguard, be useful for once and pick up that toy. You know I'm not allowed in there." Jim remained silent. His training and sense of duty prevented him from breaking protocol, even as Haley's demands grew more insistent and abusive. "What's the matter? Are you deaf as well as dumb?" Haley sneered. "I said pick up the toy. It's right there at your feet. Or are you too important to help a child?" Daniel, caught between his desire for the toy and his discomfort at his aunt's behavior, spoke up timidly. "You said he's not allowed to leave, Aunt Haley." Haley huffed, her voice dripping with annoyance. "Why does everything have to be so tough in this heat? Watch and learn." Without another word, she looked around, realizing most of the crowd had moved toward the front gate, and taking advantage of the situation, she crossed over the fence, sliding into the off-limits area, walking purposefully toward Jim, her face contorted with a combination of anger and prejudice. She covered the distance, paying no mind to the rules or the gravity of the location. "What manner of guard are you?" she spat, now standing uncomfortably close to Jim. "Too good to hand over a toy? Or maybe you're just following orders like a good little soldier." No mind of your own. Jim remained motionless, but inside he was battling a storm of emotions. The woman's proximity, her Blatant disregard for protocol and her racist taunts were pushing him to his limits. Haley, frustrated by Jim's lack of response, made a fateful decision. She raised her hand, and in a shocking move slapped Jim across the face. There, let's see you ignore that you. The slapping sound reverberated through the sudden stillness that fell over the crowd. For a moment, time appeared to stand still. Then something inside Jim snapped. Years of training, of discipline, of turning the other cheek, all of it fell away in an instant. He grabbed Haley's arm, pinning her to the ground with a swift, practiced movement. In the same motion, he raised his rifle bayonet, his voice ringing out with authority. Halt! The echo of Jim's voice sliced through the air loud enough to command attention from the east gate surroundings. His gaze remained locked on the woman's piercing blue eyes, as a few onlookers close enough to witness the scene gasped quietly, though most people around the area hadn't noticed the incident. This small group, curious and unsettled, began inching closer. The atmosphere quickly filled with the faint clicks of camera shutters and occasional flashes from phones as these few bystanders tried to capture the tense moment. Daniel stood frozen, eyes wide with shock and fear, his beloved toy guard completely forgotten amid the sudden confrontation. Noticing the cameras pointed her way, Haley's tone changed in a second. She started weeping dramatically, her voice rising to a high, keening, "Please, he spare my life. I mean to do no harm. I only tripped over the fence trying to get a good picture of you." She wailed, her melodrama seeming convincing enough to those who did not know her past behavior. The flashes from the camera and Haley's sudden change in strategy breaks the attention of Jim. His grip on the rifle and bayonet loosened, falling to the ground with a clatter. Understanding what he had done, Jim dropped Haley, stepping back in horror at own actions, grabbing the attention of the meager crowd. Haley's face changed to one of pretended helplessness. "Please," she whimpers so loudly for all to hear. "Can you help me get back over the fence? I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding and for climbing the fence. I won't do it again. You see, sometimes I get confused and do things not supposed to be done." Words just keep spilling out of her mouth, anything to save herself from the situation. But Jim was deaf to her pleas. Grudgingly, he stayed his frustration and kept his cool under the watchful eyes of onlookers nodding toward the east gate. He walked her slowly around the perimeter, pointing her away from the restricted area. As they approached the gate, Jim opened it and let her pass by. Just when she had passed over into the clearing, Haley shot him a brief, smug glance submerged beneath her contrite face. Without warning, she spat at his shoes, a small, rebellious gesture that no one in the crowd took notice of, but its meaning was clear. Jim stepped forward, unmoving, his face impassive, as she rejoined Daniel, who stood nearby, wide-eyed and confused. Haley thrust the toy guard figure into Daniel's hands. "That's how you do it, boy," she whispered and patted him on the back. "You don't let anyone push you around, not even these old guards." Jim stood rooted to the spot, facing the judgmental stares of the onlookers. Some looked shocked, others angry, and a few seemed confused by the rapid turn of events. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the silent accusations in their eyes. In that moment, Jim realized that his actions, regardless of the provocation, had crossed a line he had sworn never to cross. The situation quickly descended into sea chaos as several bystanders were distressed by what they had seen, alerted a nearby security guard who approached to assess the situation. As word spread, the crowd gathered for the changing of the guard's ceremony gradually drifted toward the commotion, drawn by conflicting accounts of the incident. Voices clashed as people shared their versions. Some defended Haley's act as a misunderstanding, while others condemned her behavior, creating a ripple of tension and curiosity that scattered across the spectators. Some viewers were extremely vocal in their defense of Jim. He shouted, "Stop." At first, one tourist said to a security guard that lady was bothering him the whole day. She even slapped him. There were others who had seen anything Haley attempted, but were quick to criticize Jim. He attacked a civilian, someone screamed. "Is this the way the Royal Guards behave now?" While the arguments were going on, Major Timothy Hall approached Jim from behind the fence. His face set a mask of disappointment and bewilderment, obviously hard at work trying to make sense of the impeccable soldier he knew Jim to be, with the scene of disorder before him. Before Jim could offer any explanation, Haley's shrill voice cut through the commotion. "He assaulted me," she shrieked, her earlier bravado replaced by a performance of victimhood. "I only wanted to get a good picture, and he attacked me. This is outrageous." Major Hall, balancing the need for protocol with the importance of preserving the semi of the procession, made a quick decision. "Sergeant Harrington," he commanded in a low, controlled voice, "you're relieved from your post. Follow me to my office right now. Don't wait for an answer." He turned Trusting the security guard to deal with the woman and the dispersing crowd, Jim nodded briefly, respectfully, and stepped away from the scene as he followed Major Hall, the murmurs of the crowd fading into the background when they reached Major Hall's office. Jim tried to explain the full sequence of events. "Sir, I must explain exactly what happened. I don't want to hear it," Sergeant Major Hall interrupted sharply. As he closed the door behind him, it's hard to believe a woman would go as far as jumping the Buckingham Palace's fence simple for over a toy stop, making excuses. "But sir, you saw her earlier, making racist remarks and disturbing the peace." Jim counted, his voice tense with frustration. Major Hall's gaze hardened as he regarded Jim. Shouting provocative words and jumping over fences are not connected. "Sergeant Harrington, enough. Your duty was to maintain composure and discipline regardless of the provocation." His tone was steely, leaving no argument here. "Do I make myself clear?" Jim clamped down hard on his jaw, forcing himself to nod. The tension between them was almost palpable, hanging there unsaid, thick and festering. "I'm disappointed in you, Harrington," he said, his voice made heavy with frustration. "You know better than this. Hand over your uniform and rifle. You're suspended pending a full investigation." The words of Major Hall came down on Jim like a hammer blow. He had given up so much to wear this uniform, to serve with honor and distinction. Now, in the space of a few chaotic minutes, it was all being stripped away. As Jim changed into civilian clothes, he felt a wave of defeat wash over him. The uniform he had worn with such pride now lay folded on Major Hall's desk, along with his career, his dignity, and everything he had worked for. He walked out of the office feeling naked and vulnerable, acutely aware of the eyes that followed him as he made his way out of the palace grounds. At the east gate outside, Jim scanned the crowd for any sign of Haley and Daniel, but they had vanished, swallowed up by the flow of people in the background. The ceremony was drawing to a close, yet within the short period of its 45 minutes, everything had changed. What started off as any ordinary day had rolled into something deeply ominous, as if the mundane patterns of his universe had been silently, irreversibly shifted. Standing alone among the throng, Jim felt the shift settle over him like a shroud. At the end of a personal age, the changing of the guard ceremony, with its traditional 45 minutes of pomp and pageantry, was now over. A new shift of royal guards had taken up posts, ready to stand watch for the next 48 hours. The afternoon sun still blazed overhead as Jim sat on a bench outside Buckingham Palace, the events of the past hour pressing heavily on his mind. Now, with his uniform and position stripped away, he felt uttered adrift in a sea of uncertainty, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly in the space of a single ceremony. The crowds from the ceremony had mostly dispersed, but there was still a steady flow of tourists milling about the palace grounds. Jim sat unnoticed among them, no longer the center of attention he had been only moments before. As he struggled to come to terms with what he had done, Jim saw a familiar face slowly approaching him. It was Daniel, the same little boy who had been one of those who had teased him earlier. The boy's eyes were open wide with a combination of fear and confusion. Obviously, he did not see Jim in his distinctive guard uniform. "Excuse me, sir," came a tiny, quivering voice. Jim looked up to see Daniel standing before him, eyes wide with worry. "Have you seen a blonde woman with blue eyes, about 5 feet tall? She was of a purple crop top and long jeans." "No, leave me alone, boy," Jim replied coldly, his voice edged with bitterness. The thought of helping anyone connected to the woman who had cost him his job felt impossible. "I am lost, sir. That woman's my aunt. I came here with her to watch the procession, but I can't find her anywhere. Can you help me?" Jim looked away, unwilling to meet Daniel's gaze, resentment simmering beneath the surface. "Please, I don't know my way home. My aunt and I lived in the suburb, and we rarely visited London," Daniel pleaded, tears seeping into his voice. "Can you stay with me until we find my aunt? I'm scared." Jim looked at the boy, torn between the impulse to walk away and a lingering sense of duty. He glanced around the area, searching for any sign of Haley, but she was nowhere to be seen. The afternoon was wearing on, but there was still plenty of daylight left. Sighing heavily, Jim finally nodded. "All right, lad, we'll find her." As they started walking, Jim's voice softened, but held an unmistakable edge. "Just so you know, I'm doing this because you're a minor," he muttered, the hurt clear in his voice. "You were throwing peanuts at me earlier, remember? That's part of the reason I lost my job." Daniel looked up to take in Jim's face, immediately a flicker of guilt soon crossing his features. Jim glanced at him, briefly noting the boy's remorse, but keeping his focus on the path ahead, determined to see this through despite the bitter taste it left in his mouth. "You're the guard, the one my aunt was yelling at." Daniel's voice was but a whisper. When Jim nodded, the boy's face crumpled, and he looked down, clearly overwhelmed. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to get you in trouble. Daniel stuttered, struggling to find any explanation for his or his aunt's behavior. His mouth opened and closed as he searched for words that wouldn't come. "You just didn't know better," Jim finished quietly, his tone softer than before. The boy's remorse was evident, and though it didn't undo the damage, it softened something in Jim, a small glimmer of understanding passing between them. As they continued walking in search of Haley. "Why did you become a guard?" he asked suddenly, looking up at Jim with genuine interest. Jim thought for a second. "I wanted to serve my country, to be part of something bigger than myself," he said, with a tinge of pride and sadness in his voice. "I thought standing guard at the palace was a way to protect our history and traditions." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "It looked really hard standing still for that long. Especially in this heat, it takes a lot of practice and discipline," Jim admitted. "But that's part of the job." As they continued their search, Daniel opened up more. "I've been staying with Aunt Haley since my parents died," he said quietly. "It was a plane crash. Aunt Haley doesn't really want me around. I think she's always angry or ignoring me." Jim felt a pang of sympathy for the boy. Despite his earlier role in the day's events, Daniel was clearly a child in need of guidance and care. "That must be very hard for you," Jim said softly. "But that doesn't excuse bad behavior. Respect and kindness should never be sacrificed for approval or attention." Daniel nodded solemnly, clutching his toy guard figure tightly. "I learned. I will not do it again, I promise." As they walked, Jim found himself reflecting on his own journey. He thought about the challenges he had faced growing up, the mentors who had guided him towards a path of service and honor. In Daniel, he saw a child at a crossroads, capable of either following in his aunt's footsteps of prejudice or choosing a better path. Jim said as they walked, "Being a guard isn't just about standing still and looking impressive. It's about honor, duty, and pride in what's important. Every person, no matter where they come from or what they look like, can personify those virtues." Daniel turned to Jim with newly found admiration. Do you think I could be a guard someday?" Jim smiled, a genuine warmth spreading throughout him. "For the first time since the incident, if you work hard and treat others with respect, you could be anything you set your mind to." As they continued their search, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the palace grounds, Jim realized that this interaction with Daniel was giving him a new perspective on his own situation. Yes, he had been unemployed, but maybe there was still something in which he could be useful, make a difference. The uniform did not make him. The man's actions and values did. Suddenly, they heard a commotion coming from the far corner of the west gate of the palace. Jim's instincts, honed over years of service, immediately went on high alert. "Stay close," he told Daniel as they moved toward the source of the commotion. As they rounded a corner, they saw a sight that made Jim's blood boil. They're harassing another black guard stationed at the furthest side of the gate. Was Haley, her voice shrieking insults across the open space full of the same venom shed just dished out to Jim. "Hey, you!" Haley screamed at the impassive guard. "What's the matter? Can't you smile for the camera? Or are you just like the last fake guard?" Jim felt a jolt of anger see across him. The earlier confrontation had cost him his job, his dignity, and almost lost him his control. But now, as he watched another guard under the same abuse, he knew he could not sit by and do nothing. He had to do something, but this time he would do so without limited by his uniform. He strode was as broad as his feet allowed. "Prepare to face Haley." "Excuse me," Jim said, his voice sharp as he faced Haley. "I think that is quite enough." Haley turned, her face twisted in a sneer. "And who do you think you are?" she spat. "This is none of your business." Jim didn't budge, his posture erect and dignified even without his uniform. "Actually, is my business. I'm the guard you harassed earlier, the one you got suspended." Haley's eyes expanded, widening as she recognized Jim, a flicker of a victorious grin flashing across her face before settling into a MK of bravado. "Oh, it's you," she drawled, her voice thick with disdain. "I see now. You can talk, come to cause more trouble, have you?" Her gaze was sharp, mocking, as if she held all the power, dismissing any hint of remorse. Jim felt his jaw clench, but he steadied himself, reminded of the boys standing anxiously beside him. "No," Jim replied calmly. "I've come to tell you that your behavior is a disgrace, not just to the royal institution, but to your young nephew as well." He gestured to Daniel, who stood a few paces back, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. Haley's face flushed with anger. "How dare you lecture me about my nephew? You know nothing about our situation." "I know enough," Jim Count it, I know that a child deserves better than to be taught hate and disrespect. I know that the uniform these guards wear represents something far greater than your narrow-minded prejudices." As Jim spoke, he noticed curious people closing in around them, drawn by the confrontation. Among them, he spotted a familiar face. Major Hall, who must have had just taken his afternoon break following the rites. That was the only explanation for seeing such a figure outside the palace gate. Major Timothy Hall pushed his way through the gathering crowd, his face a mask of stern professionalism. His eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of concern and curiosity as he took in the scene, glancing from Jim to Haley and finally to young Daniel. "What's going on here?" Major Hall's authoritative voice cut through the tension. Standing tall in his immaculate uniform, he was a stark contrast to Jim in his civilian clothes. "Jim, I dismissed you from duty waiting to be judged, and now you're here, causing trouble. Does a thing like that have no standing or sense and honor in you?" Jim instinctively straightened out, old habits refusing to die. "Sir, yes, sir." This woman, he pointed calmly to Haley, was hassling another black royal guard. Major Hall's gaze snapped to Haley, who quickly dropped her smirking grin, replacing it with an expression of feigned innocence. She widened her eyes, adopting a sweet, almost childlike tone as she spoke. "Sir, I don't see the big deal," she said, clasping her hands together. "I only wanted a photograph with the royal guard. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." She cast a rapid, practiced look in the direction of the onlookers, as though expecting them to swallow her act, and Jim clenched his jaw and watched her performance with a blend of frustration and disbelief, while Major Hall's countenance remained unreadable as he took in the conflicting accounts. "Honor means everything to me, Sir." Jim said, his voice steady. "That's exactly why I can't stand by and allow this woman to desecrate. It's sullying our heritage with her slender line and prejudice." Though Major Hall was about to make up his mind, Daniel stood up straight. The young boy took a deep breath and took the courage to stand before the major. "It wasn't my fault, sir," he said, looking up at Major Hall. "My aunt, she jumped over the fence earlier to grab my toy. She slapped him first." His brows shot up in surprise as he turned to Haley, now spluttering in indignation. "That's preposterous," Haley exclaimed. "You can't possibly believe the word of a child over an adult." "Hune's telling the truth," Jim calmly replied. "After the slap, she abandoned Daniel in the crowd. I was helping him search for her when we found her harassing another guard." Major Hall's face grew stormy as he processed this newest development. He looked at Daniel, his voice easing a little. "Is that so?" Young man Daniel nodded furiously, his face screwed up with remorse. "Yes, Sir. Aunt Haley said awful things to the guard all day. I was bad, also pitching peanuts and hanging out around the palace when I should have stayed far away." His voice faded off lower as his face twisted in ashamed repentance. Really of that the sincerity in Daniel's eyes was not up for debate, and within that second, Jim felt a surge of pride for the boy touched by his honesty. Jim glanced at him, both surprised and grateful for Daniel's take to speak the truth. Major Hall's gaze softened slightly as he looked between Daniel and Haley, clear weighing the conflicting accounts. The boy's earnest admission stood in stark contrast to Haley's calculated innocence, and the increasing crowd seemed to hold its breath, sensing a shift in the air, realizing that her nephew had turned against her. Haley whirled on Daniel in a rage. "You ungrateful little brat," she spat. Her face was twisted with anger. "I knew you'd be on his side. You're a problem, always have been. Just like your parents. I didn't want you along. That's why I dropped you in that crowd, hoping you'd get lost." The venom in Haley's voice was a surprise to everyone in the room, including Jim and Major Hall. Daniel's face screwed up, his shoulders shaking, as he realized the full measure of his aunt's hate. Jim reacted instinctively, moving closer to the boy and laying a shielding hand on his shoulder. Major Hall's face darkened at Haley's outburst. "Madam," he said, his voice cold with barely contained anger, "I think you've said quite enough." Turning to Jim, Major Hall's expression came with a full understanding. "Sergeant Harrington, I owe you an apology. It seems I acted hastily earlier, without full knowledge of the situation." Jim nodded, accepting the apology with grace. "Thank you, sir. I understand the position you were in." Major Hall turned to address the gathering crowd, his voice carrying authority and resolve. "If anybody of you witnessed what went down earlier between this lady and the royal guard, please come forward. If anybody has film or footage, we welcome your testimony. The Crown thanks you for your courage to speak out." He paused, letting his words sink in among the crowd. "Your bravery in seeking to expose the truth is indeed remarkable." Many onlookers looked at each other, some wanting to stretch out for their phones. Others stepped up, a few mulling among the as they went about to give their accounts as the scene unfolded. De-escalate Jim had a small hope, a quiet feeling that this brutal time could bring change not only for himself but for the system. And with a glance down at Daniel, who was still shaking, having been subdued by his aunt's cruelty, Jim knew that times would be hard as the confrontation revealed not only that Jim faced prejudice, but also that Daniel was in an exposed position, being a young boy between so-called values in dire need of guidance and protection as the adults around them decided what to do. Next, Daniel clung to Jim, finding solace in the man who had treated him with gentleness and compassion in the midst of chaos. Jim placed a soothing hand on the boy's shoulder. "It is all right, lad," Jim said softly. "You have been very brave today. What your aunt said, that's not on you. You hear me?" Daniel nodded, weakly wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. Jim turned back to face Major Hall, his determination growing as he spoke. "Sir," Jim started, his voice steady and full of conviction, "I think Daniel home situation might not be safe." Haley's comments reveal a clear lack of care for his well-being. Leaving a child alone in a crowded place like this, it's more than just irresponsible, it's dangerous. Major Hall nodded gravely, his earlier stern demeanor softening as he looked at the distressed child. "I agree, Sergeant, this is a serious matter." Jim continued, "I'm fully aware that this does not fall under our responsibility as the Royal Guard, sir. But maybe Child Services should look into this. Daniel deserves better than to be left alone or treated with such disdain." As Jim spoke, he noticed Haley's face pale, the realization of the consequences of her actions finally setting in. She opened her mouth to protest, but Major Hall silenced her with a stern look. "That's an excellent suggestion, Sergeant," Major Hall said. He then turned to address a nearby police officer who had been called to the scene. "Officer, I believe we have a situation here that requires further investigation." The police officer nodded and stepped forward, assuming control of the situation after listening to Jim and Daniel's accounts, reviewing Haley's behavior and evaluating the evidence collected from phone recordings. They found sufficient ground for prosecution. "Ma'am," the officer said to Haley with firmness, "based upon what we have been told and upon your own behavior, we will be charging you under the public order law. Secondly, we have concerns about the well-being of the child that need to be looked into." All of Haley's previous bravado fell completely. "You can't do this," she weakly argued. "I am his guardian. You don't have the right." Haley's protests fell on deaf ears as the officers prepared to escort her away. One officer came forward accompanied by a social worker from the Child Welfare Department who told Jim and Major Hall that they would go over everything concerning Daniel and told them that his safety was at the forefront of their minds, and if need be that temporary arrangements will be made in order to protect Daniel for now. Daniel, still holding his toy guard figure, looked up to Jim in a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "With what's going to happen to me now?" he asked, his voice small and frightened. Jim fell to his knees again, this time meeting Daniel. "Eyes, don't worry, lad, are going to protect you. And all of me taken care of, and I promise you, they'll find you a place. Will I see you again?" asked Sir Daniel in small, hopeful voice. Jim smiled warmly, reaching to gently ruffle the boy's hair. "I hope so," Kitty replied, "but even if you don't see me in my post here again, you'll always have that guard figurine to remind you. And if you recall the lesson I taught you, then you've already got me right here," he said, tapping Daniel's chest lightly above his heart as Daniel was led away. He turned, glancing back over his shoulder, his eyes searching for Jim, watching him go. Jim felt a rush of complex emotions. There was relief that justice was finally being served, sadness for the hardships Daniel had endured, and a renewed sense of purpose. He had joined the Royal Guard to protect and serve, and today, stripped of his uniform but not his principles, he had done exactly that. Major Hall watched the scene unfolding with a thoughtful expression. As the last of the onlookers dispersed, he turned to Jim with newfound respect in his eyes. "Sergeant Harrington," he began, his tone markedly different from their earlier interaction, "I believe I owe you more than just an apology. Your actions today, both in uniform and out, have demonstrated the virtues of the Royal Guard: integrity, compassion, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even in the face of personal cost." Jim stood straighter, a habit ingrained from years of service, even as he stood there in civilian clothes. "Thank you, sir," he replied, his voice steady. Major Hall continued, "What you did today, helping young Daniel, standing up to injustice, And keeping one's dignity intact even when let go, that is the true concept of a sentinel. Not just some stiff-limbed figure in uniform, but the very embodiment of honor, duty, and compassion through our actions. Jim's eyes welled up as the major words and change of events caught his throat, but Hall wasn't done yet. "I'd like to extend an offer for you to return to your post, Sergeant May," Hall finally said in a formal tone, though laced with warmth. "The Royal Guard needs people like you, people who know that what we do is not for display purposes alone. We need guards capable of moving with the changing times, yet clinging to our core values." Jim's heart was racing with the prospect, for only hours ago he had thought his career would never be the same, his dreams shattered. Now, here he was being given a second chance, a chance at the job that he loved with a rueful sense of purpose. "Sir, I don't know what to say," Jim stammered, very uncharacteristically at a loss for words. Major Hall smiled, a rare sight that transformed his usually stern features. "Say yes, Sergeant. The uniform is waiting for you. And I assure you, I stand behind you fully. Your actions today have served as a powerful reminder of the true values the Guard represents." With a deep breath, Jim straightened his posture and met Major Hall's gaze. "Yes, sir. I would be honored to return to my post." As Jim walked back into Major Hall's office to retrieve his uniform, he felt a profound sense of renewal. The weight of the day's events still lingered, but was now tempered by a newfound understanding of his role. But he soon realized he stood for more than a tradition. His appearance in the Palace Guard meant tenacity, pride, and was a proof that including Ivety strengthens institutions. Later that day, Jim returned to his post again, wearing the red uniform and carrying the rifle bayonet that stamped his role. As he looked at the crowd, he saw Daniel standing near the edge of the crowd, flanked by another guardian, probably a social worker, or maybe a family member that had been assigned to his care. The boy's face lit up with recognition, and he waved. Jim enthusiastically returned the slight smile, still holding tightly onto his toy guard figure. Despite keeping the professional composure, he could not help the warmth spreading through his chest. Then he knew he had made an impression for Daniel, perhaps a seed of respect and understanding that would draw much goodness in molding the boy's future. It was a quiet yet profound reminder of why he had taken up this role: to serve, to protect, and at times to inspire.